Hi, and welcome to this Excosoft webinar titled Saving Money by Reusing Translations in Skribenta. My name is Jonathan Landin, and I will be your presenter today. And thanks for joining. I hope you will enjoy the next 20 minutes. So the purpose of today's webinar is to show you how you can save translation costs by reusing existing translations in Skribenta. So this webinar is designed for you who are knowledgeable about Skribenta Web. So you have used Skribenta Web to some extent. And you, of course, you're using Skribenta and you are translating. So before we start, let me just say some words about myself. So I'm a technical communicator and, well, I'm really interested in how we can manage content and optimize things, how we create, version, and translate technical documentation. So the schedule for today is that after the introduction, so I will show you what it means actually to reuse translations and why we should do it. And I have two examples to show you on how we can reuse content, reuse translations in Skribenta, I should say. So I will show you also how this can be done in Skribenta. And at the end, we have time for questions. So, what does it mean to reuse translation? Well, from a point of view that we're sending translations to the translator, we are sending translation blocks. And of course, the more blocks we send, the higher the cost. So there's a relationship between number of blocks that we send and the translation cost. So our aim is, of course, to send as few blocks to the translator as possible, because that has an impact on cost. But the case is when we generally translate content in Skribenta, there might be the case that we create similar source texts. Let me give you an example. So let's say here that we have created a master file, and in this master file we have content. For instance, read the instructions carefully, as an example here. Then this is translated. We create translation block in the memory, and this is now translated to Swedish. And then when we publish the Swedish version, we get the Swedish text. Let's say half a year, 1 year later, we create a new file. And within this British English source file, we write something similar to the first file. In this case, the word carefully. So it's pronounced a little bit differently. But when creating this additional file, maybe it's another user, another technical writer who creates this file, might not be aware of that. A similar source text has already been written in another file. So when this file number 2 is translated, we create a similar Swedish translation. And of course, when we publish, we get a similar Swedish output. So this would mean that we would increase the number of blocks having kind of similar source text and similar translations, which has an impact on cost when we translate. So let me give you an example of how we can reuse translations. So let's say again that we have the source file and we have the English text and it's being translated. So this is already available. And then later on when we create the additional file. So before starting to translating and even before starting to reviewing this file, you have an opportunity to look into the memory to check if there are any similar translations and similar source text already available. So there's this function of checking similar. So what happens is that Skribenta look into the translation memory and see if there anything that is similar, and if it is, you can actually use that source text. So to replace the text that you already have with the existing one. So you're reusing the translation. So when you publish then, you will get the same Swedish output in several different manuals. Now, this has not only an impact on the translation cost, but also on usability. Since if this was a warning or a note or some content that is very important, that it is stated in the same way across several manuals. It's really good that the translations also follow the same pattern. They're expressed in the same way. So that's also important to mention. But okay, let me give you an example of how this works now in Skribenta. So let's head over to Skribenta. And here I have prepared number of publications we could examine. So here I have an installation manual for a pump. And it contains content, and the source language is British English, as we see here. So let's say now that this file that we creating a revision of this manual, and we need to add a note highlighting that the user needs to read the manual. So let's say that we add a note wrapper, and this is to be created before the existing location. So I can paste, and it looks something like this. So we have a note saying it is important that you read the instructions. So what I can do now in Skribenta is I can check in the memory to see if there's any similar source text available, which is already being translated. And the way I do that is I can click on the language flag to switch to the language that I want to translate to. Let's say that I want to translate this file to Swedish. I can click on the flag and then select Swedish. And then Skribenta will look into the memory and create the Swedish version of this file. So in this case, everything here is Swedish except the new piece of content that we added. So for each of the translation missing, because this will be a translation missing if I publish, since there is no block in the translation memory that has this source text, I can check for similar. And clicking on the sim button means that Skribenta analyzes the translation memory to try to find similar blocks. And those blocks are presented, so I can make a decision. Do I want to use this source text instead? Here, the only difference is that we have the word carefully in the version that we have in the memory. So the word careful is not stated in the content that I wrote. So let's say that you're editing a manual or creating a new manual, and you have a number of new blocks. You can click on the similar for each one of these to make a decision if you want to reuse an existing translation. So if I, in this case, click on use, I will then, well, I will reuse the existing translation. So if I then switch back to my British file, we can see that, okay, this is now the reused translation, the memory. And if I go and publish, click on publish, and we have Swedish and English selected as the language, we can have a look on both the Swedish version and the English version for this particular manual. So of course, in this case, I don't need to send anything for translation. So in this case, this is the Swedish version. So here we have, well, this is the reused translation. And similar, we have the English version. So, and in this case, this is the source text. So as you can see here, I have reused a translation. I don't need to send this publication for translation. Okay. So let's head back to and show you the example number 2. So it might be the case that you would like to reuse a translation, but the source text is a little bit different. So it's in the first case, we actually replaced the existing text that I wrote with the version that we found from the memory. and there was a slight difference in the wording. But let's say here that we have a source text saying ensure an air gap of 2.0, and this value, or this, which is a unit here, is actually a metric. It's inches. So the air gap is 2 inches. If I wrap this unit with a unit phrase and specify that the type is inches, I can make this particular text reusable, because when I translate, the actual value 2.0 will not end up in the memory. So what ends up in the memory is a placeholder, which is the unit phrase. So what this means is when I publish Skribenta and translate and publish, Skribenta takes care of the unit conversion. So in the British English PDF, it will say 2.0 inches. But in the Swedish version, it will say 5,1 centimeters. So there's a unit conversion between inches and centimeters that happens, which Skribenta takes care of, since we have wrapped the 2.0 with a unit phrase in Skribenta. So this makes it possible to reuse this translation later on. Because let's say that, well, in another manual, some other technical writer is creating similar source text. The only difference is that it says 3.0 inches instead of 2.0. So what we can do again is to check for similar translation, check in the memory, and we can then find the example saying ensure an air gap of, and then there's a placeholder for the unit. And if I use this one, we replace the text, and I can then type 3.0 and specify that this is also inches. So here I'm reusing the translation, but the source text is slightly different, and there should be a difference since there's another product model, for instance. And when I publish, then the unit conversions happen. So it says 3.0 inches in the British PDF and 7.6 centimeters in the Swedish PDF. And we can do this from the same translation block. So again, there's no need to send anything for translation. We are reusing the existing translation. So let me show you how this could look like if we head over again to Skribenta. And let's say now in this manual that we would like to add a warning indicating that users should wear gloves. So let's say that we got the product manager tells us that we need to add this warning, for instance, in the manual. So again, I will add a wrapper, and we say that this is before we add a warning, and this would then be the actual text saying that always wear gloves when handling the pump. When pumping hot liquids, the pump and its part may exceed, and then there's a temperature. So this is addition that we need to make. Okay, so now we can check for similar translations. I'm switching to Swedish, and again we see that this the red border indicates that this is a translation missing. This does not exist in the translation memory. I can click on the similar button to expand and to analyze the memory. And again, of course, here we see that there is already an existing translation. The only difference is that it says protective in this version, and we have a placeholder for the actual unit. Now, it might be the case that I want to know, okay, but where is this particular paragraph used, in which manual? Then I can right-click on the actual text and select the paragraph and select used by to see which file is using this, it contains this particular paragraph. I can expand this one here, and I can see that, okay, I have an operating manual for another product model, which is HP12. And in this particular manual, there is also this warning has already been written, and it is already translated. In this case, the temperature is 50.5. Okay, it's good to know. But in this case, I want to use this. So I click on the Use button. And again, we are reusing the existing translation. I can then switch back to my British English source content. And for this particular product model, the temperature was 45.5. And the blue border here and the brackets indicates that this is a unit phrase. And what I also need to do is to specify what type of unit it is. So I can right click on it and I can then select the phrase unit and attributes, and we go to type, and then I have a set of predefined unit conversion kind of templates which I can select from. So in this case, I know I need to select Celsius. So this is a conversion table that converts between Celsius and Fahrenheit in this case. Okay, so let's publish to check the PDF of this edition. And again, I have reused the translation and there's no need to send anything for translation. And also this unit conversion has happened between the different languages. So if we look into the Swedish, we have the Swedish text, and here it says 45,5, and it's Celsius. And in the British version, it says 114 Fahrenheit. So this is converted. And we in parentheses, we're also stating the Celsius, because this might be the convention that the pattern that we need to do for the British English version. So this kind of unit conversion is handled by Skribenta as we reuse translations. Okay. So let's head back to the presentation. So these are two examples of how we can reuse translation. In the first example, we were actually replacing the source text with existing text in the memory. And then in the second example, we reuse the translation, but there was a slight difference. And that was the unit that was different, perhaps between different product models. So in Skribenta, there's a number of elements that we can use to make translations reusable. So as I showed you in the this inline and the phrase menu, we can select from a number of different possibilities. So the affix phrase is used if you have like an inline image at the end of a paragraph. You can wrap that image with an affix phrase. So if you have several paragraphs where the only difference is an inline image at the end, but also at the beginning, you can wrap those images with an affix phrase, which means that you can reuse the same translation for these multiple paragraphs. The counter works in a similar way. So with a counter, you can create your own specific counting system. So if you have a numbered list that starts with 2, 4, 6, and 8, etc. And if you have a list where you have conditions, you can use a counter to create counting system. So if the only difference between several paragraphs is the actual number at the beginning, you can wrap that and create a counter to reuse the same block for these multiple paragraphs. And date is used if you have multiple paragraphs where the only difference is the date. The date format might be different, and there might be different dates that you specify. You can wrap the date with this date phrase and then reuse the same translation block for these multiple paragraphs. Unit, that is the one we used in the two examples. The second example, where we wrapped the actual value, the inches, with a unit phrase. And variables, of course, that's something that you use as a Skribenta user for function name, product name, etc. And using variables also means that several paragraphs can use the same translation. And lastly, value is a phrase you can use to wrap values that are perhaps not metric. It can be phone numbers or article numbers or any value. So if you have two or more sentences, where the only difference is the article number, you can wrap the article number with a value phrase and then use the same translation. Okay, so these were examples of making it possible to reuse translations in Skribenta. I would like to mention that this is one way you can do it. Of course, in the examples that I showed you, especially the second example, one alternative is to put the warning in a separate file, which you then can include in your different publications. So you single source the content. That is an alternative that you can use. What I would like to say is that this functionality, this possibility of reusing, we will extend in Skribenta, perhaps during next year, so you can analyze clusters of source text. So in the case you have written many source files and you want to analyze if there's similar source text, you can do that and then create clusters to find source text that are similar, to make a decision on which one you would like to use to make your documentation more consistent and also to save on your translation cost. So heads up for a webinar that will talk about source text clustering. So I think now there is actually time for questions. So I'd be happy to answer any of your questions that you might have.